The old mansion loomed on the outskirts of Mulberry Pines, a shadowed silhouette against the twilight sky. Its once grand facade had long surrendered to the ravages of time, ivy weaving through the cracked stone and broken windows like nature's own chains, binding the forsaken place to the earth. The house had a life of its own, its decayed structure groaning and creaking as though whispering the secrets of its dark past. Sarah Langley stood at the iron gate, her breath a visible mist in the chilly evening air. The gate, like the house, was cloaked in rust and neglect, its hinges protesting with a high-pitched whine as she pushed it open. She had heard the stories, everyone in Mulberry Pines had. The whispers of strange creatures and haunting voices that surrounded the mansion had captivated her ever since she was a child. Now, as a determined journalist in her late 20s, Sarah was here to uncover the truth, to peel back the layers of legend and expose the reality beneath. The path to the front door was overgrown, weeds and wildflowers reclaiming the space where footsteps had long ceased to tread. Sarah's footsteps crunched on the gravel, a sound startling in the heavy silence. She paused for a moment on the porch, her eyes drawn to the carved wooden door, its intricate designs barely visible beneath the grime and decay. Gathering her courage, she reached for the tarnished brass doorknob and twisted. The door swung open with a groan, as if begrudgingly allowing her entrance. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of mildew, the remnants of past grandeur clinging desperately to the high ceilings and elegant moldings. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the cobwebs that draped like tattered curtains from the chandelier above. She stepped into the foyer, the hardwood floorboards creaking beneath her weight. To her right, the grand staircase spiraled into the gloom of the upper floors, while to her left, a set of double doors led into what appeared to be a library. Sarah opted for the library first, drawn by the promise of old records and diaries that might hold the keys to the mansion's secrets. The doors resisted, then gave way with a sudden lurch, sending a cloud of dust into the air. The library was a cavernous room, lined floor to ceiling with bookshelves filled with volumes in various states of decay. She moved slowly, her flashlight tracing the spines of books that had not been touched in decades. Some titles were familiar, classics of literature and history, while others were strange and archaic, their languages long forgotten. A large, ornate desk sat at the center of the room, covered in a thick layer of dust and scattered papers. Sarah's heart raced as she spotted an old family portrait above the fireplace. The eyes of the figures, stern-looking parents and their 3 children, seemed to follow her, an effect of the artist's skill, or perhaps something more sinister. She approached the desk, drawn by the sight of a leather-bound journal left open, its pages yellowed and fragile. As she reached for it, a sudden noise broke the silence, a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate from the very walls. Her flashlight flickered, casting wild shadows across the room. The growl came again, this time from the direction of the basement door at the far end of the hall. Sarah's pulse quickened, fear mingling with curiosity. She had come here for answers, and it seemed they were closer than she had anticipated. Steeling herself, she made her way towards the sound, each step taking her deeper into the heart of the mansion's dark mystery. As she approached the basement door, the growling ceased, replaced by an eerie silence. The door was heavy, made of solid oak, and adorned with iron hinges. She hesitated, then placed her hand on the cold metal handle. With a deep breath, she pulled it open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into the blackness below. The air that wafted up was colder, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something acrid and foul. Sarah aimed her flashlight down the steps, the beam barely penetrating the inky darkness. She took a tentative step, then another, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the confined space. Halfway down, she paused, listening intently. The silence was thick, almost tangible, pressing in around her. She was about to take another step, when a shadow moved at the edge of her vision. Her flashlight jerked towards it, but there was nothing there, just the darkness, deep and impenetrable. She reached the bottom of the stairs and found herself in a large, musty basement. Old furniture and forgotten relics were scattered about, shrouded in dust and cobwebs. In the far corner, a door slightly ajar caught her attention. She moved towards it, her heart pounding in her chest. As she pushed it open, the low growl returned, louder this time, and more menacing. The beam of her flashlight fell on a grotesque figure crouched in the shadows, a humanoid creature, with elongated limbs and sharp, glinting claws. The creature's eyes reflected the light, 2 points of malevolent glow in the darkness. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the thing began to rise, its movements slow and deliberate. She stumbled back, her mind racing with fear and disbelief. This was no ghost, no figment of imagination, it was something real, something monstrous. Her instincts took over, and she turned and ran, her flashlight bobbing wildly as she fled up the stairs. The growl turned into a snarl, and she could hear the creature's claws scraping against the stone floor as it gave chase. She reached the top of the stairs and slammed the door shut, her hands trembling as she fumbled to lock it. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a heavy thud against the door, followed by another. The creature was trying to break through. Sarah backed away, her eyes wide with terror, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had come seeking a story, but what she had found was beyond anything she could have imagined. The mansion was not just haunted, it was home to unspeakable horrors. And she was now trapped within its walls. The thudding against the basement door subsided, leaving Sarah in a tense, trembling silence. Her heart pounded in her ears as she leaned against the wall, trying to steady her breathing. She had to think, had to figure out what to do next. She clutched her flashlight like a lifeline and moved back into the foyer, her mind racing. The library had offered no clues, only the revelation that something far worse than she had imagined lurked in the depths of the mansion. She needed more information, anything that could help her understand what she was dealing with and how to escape. Deciding to search the upper floors, Sarah made her way to the grand staircase. Each step groaned under her weight, echoing through the vast emptiness of the house. She paused at the landing, casting her light around to survey the second floor. The hallway stretched out before her, lined with closed doors, each one a potential Pandora's box of horrors. The first door on her left opened into a bedroom, its opulent furnishings covered in dust. An ornate canopy bed dominated the room, its once luxurious drapes now tattered and grey. She moved to the dresser, where a cracked mirror reflected her pale, anxious face. A sense of unease settled over her as she examined the room, but nothing seemed immediately dangerous. She turned to leave when a sudden chill swept through the air. The temperature dropped noticeably, her breath forming misty clouds in the beam of her flashlight. The mirror began to fog over, and she watched, frozen, as words slowly appeared on its surface. Help us. Sarah's stomach knotted with fear and confusion. The words seemed to pulse with a life of their own, fading and reappearing as if the mirror itself were breathing. She backed out of the room, the cold following her into the hallway. Determined to press on, she tried the next door, revealing a child's nursery. The room was eerily preserved, as though waiting for its small occupants to return. A wooden rocking horse stood in one corner, its paint peeling, and a crib sat against the far wall. Toys were scattered across the floor, frozen in mid-play, their bright colors dulled by a layer of dust. A doll caught Sarah's eye, sitting in a small chair by the window. It was a porcelain doll, with wide blue eyes and a cracked face. As she stepped closer, she noticed its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if it had been watching her. A shiver ran down her spine as she reached out to touch it. Before her fingers could make contact, the doll's head snapped upright, its eyes locking onto hers. A whisper filled the room, a child's voice faint and distant. "Come play with us," it beckoned, the sound sending icy fingers down her spine. She recoiled, stumbling backward, her flashlight flickering as if reacting to the sudden surge of malevolent energy. She fled the nursery, the door slamming shut behind her as she bolted down the hallway. Panic surged through her veins, but she forced herself to focus. She needed answers, not just to escape, but to understand the twisted history that had turned this mansion into a den of horrors. At the end of the hall, a pair of double doors stood slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of another large room. She pushed them open to find a master bedroom, grand and decayed like the rest of the house. The canopy bed was draped in heavy, moth-eaten curtains, and an elaborate wardrobe stood against one wall. On the bedside table, she found a journal, its cover worn and pages yellowed with age. She flipped it open, the handwriting neat and meticulous, chronicling the daily life of the mansion's last inhabitants. The entries started innocuously enough, details about social events, weather, and mundane activities. But as she read on, the tone grew darker. Strange noises from the basement again. Harold says it's just the pipes, but I know better. Something is down there. The entries became increasingly frantic, describing shadowy figures, unexplainable phenomena, and the growing sense of dread that permeated the household. The final entry was a scrawl of terror. Harold has locked himself in the basement, says he must finish what he started. The children, they are gone. God help us all. A chill ran through Sarah as she closed the journal. The pieces were starting to fit together. Harold, the mansion's owner, had been involved in something dark, something that had unleashed these creatures and driven him to madness. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from downstairs, followed by a guttural snarl. The creature from the basement had broken free. Sarah's heart raced as she pocketed the journal and ran to the staircase. She had to find a way out before it found her. Descending the stairs, she was careful to avoid the places where the old wood groaned loudest. The foyer was eerily silent, the front door still slightly ajar from her earlier entrance. She was almost at the door when she heard the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against wood. The creature was close. Without hesitation, Sarah bolted through the door and into the night. The cold air bit at her skin, but she didn't stop until she reached the safety of her car. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the keys, finally managing to start the engine. She sped away, the mansion shrinking in her rearview mirror, its dark windows watching her escape. As she drove, her mind raced with the horror she had uncovered. She had escaped with her life, but the creatures within that house, whatever they were, remained. She knew she had to return, to find a way to stop the evil that lurked within the mansion's walls. But for now, she needed to regroup, to plan, and to prepare for the fight that lay ahead. Sarah didn't drive far before pulling over, her hands still shaking as she tried to steady her nerves. The journal she had taken from the mansion sat on the passenger seat, an ominous reminder of the horrors she had witnessed. She took a deep breath, flipping through the pages again, hoping to find something, anything, that might help her understand what Harold had done. Her eyes settled on a passage she had overlooked before, an entry that described a hidden room in the basement. According to Harold's journal, this room contained artifacts and symbols used in his experiments. Sarah shuddered, remembering the grotesque creature she had encountered. These weren't just monsters, they were creations, abominations born from twisted science and dark rituals. The night was deepening, and Sarah knew she couldn't face the mansion alone. She needed help, someone who believed in the supernatural as she did. She thought of Dr. Emily Hart, a professor of occult studies at the nearby university. Emily was an old friend and had often shared her theories about the thin veil between our world and others. If anyone could help, it was Emily. The drive to Emily's house was filled with a tension that clung to Sarah's every thought. She replayed the events in her mind, the terrifying encounter with the basement creature, the eerie message on the nursery mirror, and the journal's final, frantic entries. Each piece fit together like a puzzle, forming a picture too horrifying to ignore. Emily's house was a quaint, old Victorian on the edge of town, its warm lights a comforting contrast to the mansion's cold, dark emptiness. Sarah knocked urgently, and within moments, Emily opened the door, her eyes widening in surprise at the sight of her friend. "Sarah. What's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost," Emily said, her voice filled with concern. Sarah stepped inside, feeling the warmth and safety of the house wash over her. "I need your help, Emily. It's about the old mansion on the outskirts of town. There's something terrible happening there. I found this," she said, handing Emily the journal. Emily's expression grew serious as she flipped through the pages, her brow furrowing. Harold Kingsley's journal. "I've heard rumors about his experiments, but I never thought they were true. If what he wrote here is accurate, he was meddling with forces beyond our understanding." Sarah nodded. "I encountered one of his creations. It was monstrous. And there's more in that house, I'm sure of it. We need to go back, find a way to stop them." Emily looked up, determination in her eyes. "We can't do this alone. We'll need supplies, protection, and maybe even some of the artifacts Harold mentioned. Let's get what we need and head out at first light." The rest of the night was a blur of preparation. Emily gathered her occult tools, protective charms, salt, candles, and a grimoire of spells. Sarah checked her camera, flashlight, and recorder, ensuring everything was in working order. As dawn approached, the two women shared a brief moment of silence, steeling themselves for the ordeal ahead. The drive back to the mansion was tense, the early morning light casting long shadows across the landscape. As they approached, the house loomed larger, its ominous presence palpable. Sarah parked the car, and they sat in silence for a moment, gathering their courage. "Ready?" Emily asked, her voice steady but tinged with apprehension. Sarah nodded. "Let's do this." They entered the mansion together, the air thick with anticipation and fear. The house seemed to welcome them back with a creak and a groan, its decaying grandeur a testament to its dark history. Sarah led the way to the basement, flashlight in hand, Emily close behind with her protective charms. The basement door stood ajar, just as Sarah had left it. She hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open, the cold air from below rising to meet them. They descended the stairs cautiously, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness. At the bottom, they found the hidden room mentioned in the journal. The door was heavy, reinforced with iron. Sarah and Emily exchanged a glance before pushing it open together. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay and something older, more malevolent. The room was filled with bizarre artifacts, strange, twisted sculptures, jars of unidentifiable substances, and symbols painted on the walls in a dark, dried substance. In the center of the room was an altar, covered in ancient runes and surrounded by candles that flickered as if disturbed by an unseen wind. Emily approached the altar, examining the runes. These are binding symbols, meant to contain and control. Harold must have used them to create and imprison his monsters. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. If we can destroy the altar, maybe we can break the bond and weaken the creatures. Emily nodded. We'll need to be careful. Whatever power is contained here won't go quietly. They began to dismantle the altar, careful to avoid disturbing the symbols too hastily. As they worked, the temperature dropped further, and a low growl echoed through the room. Sarah's flashlight flickered, and the shadows seemed to come alive, writhing and shifting around them. We're not alone, Emily whispered, clutching a protective charm in one hand. Sarah's heart raced as she scanned the room, the growl growing louder, more menacing. The creature from the basement was back, and it wasn't alone. Figures emerged from the shadows, twisted and grotesque, their eyes glowing with malevolent intelligence. Keep working on the altar. I'll hold them off. Sarah shouted, grabbing a piece of broken wood as a makeshift weapon. Emily continued her work, chanting a protective spell under her breath. The creatures advanced, their snarls filling the room. Sarah swung the wood at the first one, its claws raking across her arm as she fought to keep it at bay. Just as Emily finished the final rune, a blinding light erupted from the altar, the symbols glowing brightly before shattering. The creatures recoiled, their forms flickering and distorting as the power that bound them was broken. With a final, guttural scream, the creatures dissolved into shadows, leaving the room eerily silent. Sarah collapsed to the floor, her arm bleeding but her spirit unbroken. Emily rushed to her side, applying a makeshift bandage. "We did it," Sarah gasped, the weight of their victory sinking in. "We destroyed the source." Emily nodded, her face pale but determined. "But we need to make sure it's over. We need to cleanse this place, banish any remaining evil." Together, they performed a ritual of cleansing, using the grimoire's spells to purify the room and the house. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a sense of peace and finality. As they emerged from the mansion into the morning light, Sarah turned back for one last look. The house, though still decayed, no longer felt malevolent. It was just an old, abandoned building now, its dark secrets laid to rest. "Thank you, Emily," Sarah said, her voice filled with gratitude. Emily smiled. "We did it together. Let's get you to a hospital and then write that story. People need to know what happened here." Sarah nodded, feeling a sense of closure and determination. The horrors of the mansion had been faced and defeated, but the story was just beginning. As they drove away, Sarah couldn't help but feel that this was more than just a story. It was a testament to courage, friendship, and the enduring fight against the darkness that lurks within and beyond. Sarah spent the next few days in a haze of medical attention and restless sleep. The wound on her arm was deeper than she had realized, but the doctors assured her it would heal. As she lay in the hospital bed, the events of the mansion replayed in her mind, each scene vivid and haunting. Emily visited frequently, providing comfort and support, but also urging Sarah to document everything while it was fresh. "People need to know what we faced," Emily said one afternoon, handing Sarah a notebook. "Write it all down, every detail. It's not just a story, it's a warning." Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of their experience. She began to write, pouring her memories onto the pages, her words capturing the terror and triumph of their ordeal. Yet, as the days passed, an uneasy feeling gnawed at her. The mansion had been a nexus of dark forces, and though they had destroyed the altar, Sarah couldn't shake the sense that their victory was incomplete. One night, while she was alone in her hospital room, a chilling breeze swept through the room, making her shiver. She glanced around, but the windows were closed and the door was shut. The shadows seemed to deepen, and for a moment, she thought she saw movement in the corner of the room, a fleeting figure that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Her heart pounded, and she reached for her phone, dialing Emily's number with trembling fingers. The phone rang several times before Emily's groggy voice answered, "Sarah. What's wrong?" "Emily, something's not right. I think the mansion's curse isn't broken. I just saw something in my room." Emily was silent for a moment before responding, her voice steady but concerned. "I'll be there as soon as I can. Don't worry, we'll figure this out." The next morning, Emily arrived at the hospital with a determined look. "We need to go back," she said. "There's something we missed. We have to make sure the evil is truly gone." Sarah, though apprehensive, agreed. She was discharged from the hospital, and after gathering their supplies, they headed back to the mansion. The drive was somber, both women lost in their thoughts, preparing for whatever awaited them. The mansion stood as they had left it, its decayed grandeur unchanged. But as they approached, the atmosphere felt different, heavier, more oppressive. They entered cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. "We need to explore the upper floors," Emily suggested. "We focused on the basement last time, but Harold's journal mentioned strange occurrences throughout the house." They climbed the grand staircase again, this time with a sense of grim determination. The first door they tried was the nursery, its eerie stillness unchanged. The doll still sat in its chair, its eyes lifeless. Sarah shuddered, but forced herself to move on. The next room was the master bedroom, where they had found the journal. Emily began to scan the walls, her eyes narrowed in concentration. "There has to be something more here," she muttered. Sarah joined her, examining the room more thoroughly. It wasn't long before she noticed a faint outline on one wall, a seam that didn't match the rest. "Emily, over here." Together, they pried at the wall until a hidden panel slid open, revealing a small, dark passage. The air inside was even colder, carrying with it a sense of dread. They exchanged a glance, then entered the passage, their flashlights revealing a narrow staircase leading up. The stairs ended at a small door, ancient and heavy. Sarah pushed it open, revealing a hidden attic room. It was filled with strange artifacts, much like the basement, but these seemed older, more arcane. At the center of the room was another altar, similar to the one they had destroyed, but larger and more elaborate. Emily approached cautiously. This must be the source of the residual evil. Harold's main altar was a decoy. As they examined the altar, a figure materialized in the shadows, Harold's spirit, twisted and tormented. His eyes glowed with a malevolent light as he advanced. "You should not have returned," he hissed, his voice a raspy echo. Sarah and Emily stood their ground, their protective charms in hand. "We know your secrets, Harold," Sarah said, her voice strong despite her fear. "We know how to end this." Harold laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. "You think you can stop me? I am bound to this place, and so are my creations. You cannot destroy what you do not understand." Emily stepped forward, raising her grimoire. "We understand enough to know that your power comes from this altar. We destroyed one, and we can destroy this one too." The room grew colder, the shadows closing in as Harold's spirit raised its hands, summoning his monstrous creations. The creatures emerged from the darkness, their grotesque forms more terrifying than before. Sarah and Emily braced themselves for the fight. Emily began to chant, her voice strong and clear, the ancient words of the spell resonating in the room. Sarah focused on the altar, using the tools they had brought to dismantle it. The creatures advanced, but this time, they were prepared. The protective charms held them at bay, giving Sarah and Emily the time they needed. As the final rune was broken, a blinding light filled the room. Harold's spirit screamed, the sound echoing through the mansion as his form disintegrated. The creatures dissolved into shadows, their connection to the physical world severed. The light faded, leaving the room in silence. Sarah and Emily stood, exhausted but triumphant. The altar lay in ruins, its power broken. The mansion felt different now, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. "We did it," Sarah said, her voice filled with relief. Emily nodded, a weary smile on her face. "The evil is truly gone this time. The mansion is finally at peace." They left the attic, making their way back through the now quiet house. As they stepped outside into the morning light, Sarah turned to Emily. "Thank you. I couldn't have done this without you." Emily smiled. "We did it together. Now let's go home and write that story." Sarah agreed, feeling a sense of closure and peace. The mansion's dark history was behind them, and their story was just beginning. They drove away, the haunted house fading into the distance, a reminder of the courage it took to face the darkness within and beyond. The story Sarah and Emily had lived through was more than just an adventure. it was a testament to the power of friendship and courage in the face of overwhelming darkness. As they drove away from the mansion, the tension began to ease, replaced by a sense of triumph and relief. Sarah returned to her apartment, eager to put the final touches on her manuscript. The events of the past weeks had been harrowing, but now she felt a sense of purpose. She spent hours writing, her pen moving furiously as she recounted every detail, ensuring nothing was left out. Emily, too, was busy. She delved into research, wanting to understand more about the rituals and artifacts they had encountered. Though they had defeated Harold and his monstrous creations, the knowledge they had gained was invaluable, and Emily wanted to ensure that such dark magic was never practiced again. One evening, as Sarah was revising her manuscript, her phone buzzed. It was Emily. "Sarah, I found something," Emily said, her voice urgent. "There are other mentions of Harold Kingsley in historical records. He wasn't working alone." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "I mean there were others involved in his experiments. Other houses, other places where similar rituals were conducted. The mansion was just one part of a larger network." Sarah sat back, feeling the weight of Emily's words. "So, this isn't over?" "No, it's not," Emily confirmed. "We need to investigate further. If there are other places like the mansion, we have to make sure they are dealt with." Sarah felt a mix of dread and determination. "All right. Let's do it. Where do we start?" Emily hesitated for a moment before replying. "There's a town a few hours away, Whispering Pines. It's mentioned several times in Harold's journals. I think it's our next lead." The next day, they packed their gear and set out for Whispering Pines. The drive was long and quiet, each of them lost in their thoughts. The town, when they arrived, had a quaint, old-fashioned charm, with narrow streets and historic buildings that spoke of a long past. Their first stop was the local library. Emily had arranged to meet with the town historian, an elderly man named Mr. Whitaker, who was more than eager to share the town's history. As they entered the library, the scent of old books and polished wood greeted them. "Mr. Whitaker?" Emily asked, approaching an old man seated behind a large oak desk. He looked up, his eyes twinkling with curiosity. "Ah, you must be Miss Hart and Miss Collins. I've been expecting you. Please, sit down." They took their seats, and Mr. Whitaker began to speak, his voice rich with the cadence of a practiced storyteller. "Whispering Pines has a long and storied history. But there are parts of it that are darker, less spoken of. Harold Kingsley is one such part." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "Kingsley was involved in occult practices here long before he moved to the mansion you encountered. He and a group of followers conducted rituals, attempting to harness dark powers. They used various locations around town, each place chosen for its unique properties." Emily showed Mr. Whitaker the journal. "We need to know where these places are. If we can find them, we can make sure no one else uses them for similar purposes." Mr. Whitaker nodded, taking the journal and flipping through its pages. "I recognize some of these descriptions. There's an old church on the outskirts of town, abandoned for decades. It's said to be haunted, but I suspect it was one of Kingsley's ritual sites. There's also an ancient forest, known locally as the Whispering Woods, where strange things have been reported for as long as anyone can remember." Sarah and Emily exchanged a glance. The church and the woods seemed like the perfect places to start. They thanked Mr. Whitaker and left the library, heading first to the church. It stood alone, a crumbling edifice surrounded by overgrown grass and tangled vines. The air around it felt heavy, charged with a sense of foreboding. As they entered, the scent of mildew and decay hit them. The interior was dark, the stained glass windows shattered, casting eerie patterns of light on the floor. Emily led the way, her flashlight revealing more occult symbols carved into the walls, similar to those they had seen in the mansion. This place was definitely used for rituals, Emily said, her voice echoing in the empty space. We need to cleanse it. Sarah nodded, setting up their equipment. They worked methodically, performing the same cleansing rituals they had used in the mansion. As they chanted and cast the protective spells, the air seemed to lighten, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. From the church, they moved on to the Whispering Woods. The forest was dense and dark. The trees ancient and gnarled. As they ventured deeper, the whispers began, soft, almost indistinguishable from the rustling leaves, but growing louder with each step. Emily paused, consulting the journal. Harold mentions a clearing, a place of power. We need to find it. They pressed on, following a narrow, winding path until they emerged into a wide, open space. In the center stood a stone altar, covered in moss and vines, but clearly another site of dark rituals. Sarah shivered, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. We need to hurry. They began the ritual, their voices strong and steady. The whispers grew to a crescendo, the air around them vibrating with a malevolent energy. But as they completed the cleansing, the voices fell silent, the forest returning to its natural state. Exhausted but relieved, Sarah and Emily made their way back to the town. They had succeeded in their mission, but both knew this was just the beginning. The network of dark sites created by Harold and his followers was vast, and there were likely more to find. As they drove back home, Sarah glanced at Emily, her resolve hardening. We have a lot of work ahead of us. Emily nodded, a determined look in her eyes. But we're ready for it. We won't stop until every last one of these places is cleansed. Days turned into weeks as Sarah and Emily delved deeper into the dark history of Harold Kingsley and his network of ritual sites. They pored over old maps, historical records, and obscure texts, piecing together the locations and significance of each place. Each discovery brought them closer to understanding the full extent of Kingsley's influence. One evening, as they were sifting through a particularly dense tome in Emily's study, Sarah found a passage that made her pause. Listen to this, she said, her voice filled with urgency. It talks about a central hub, a nexus point where all the ritual sites converge. If we can find and neutralize this hub, it could break the network entirely. Emily looked up, her eyes widening. That could be the key to ending this once and for all. But where is this nexus point? They spent the next several hours cross-referencing the journal with other sources, gradually narrowing down potential locations. Finally, they found a reference to an old estate, long abandoned and shrouded in mystery, Ravenwood Manor. The next morning, they set out for Ravenwood, armed with their usual gear and a renewed sense of determination. The drive was long and winding, taking them deeper into the countryside, where the air grew thick with an unsettling stillness. Ravenwood Manor appeared on the horizon like a dark sentinel, its towering silhouette framed by gnarled trees and creeping fog. The mansion was even more imposing than Kingsley's old residence, its Gothic architecture exuding an aura of ancient malevolence. As they approached, the air grew colder, and a sense of dread settled over them. Sarah parked the car, and they stepped out, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound in the eerie silence. We need to be careful, Emily warned, her voice barely above a whisper. This place feels even more dangerous than the others. Sarah nodded, gripping her flashlight tightly. Let's find that nexus point and end this. They entered the manor, the heavy wooden doors creaking ominously. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. The grand foyer stretched before them, its once opulent decor now faded and crumbling. Following the clues they had gathered, they made their way through the labyrinthine halls, descending into the bowels of the manor. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The walls seemed to close in on them, the darkness almost tangible. Finally, they reached a set of heavy iron doors, intricately carved with arcane symbols. Emily consulted her grimoire, murmuring a protective incantation, before they pushed the doors open. The chamber beyond was vast and circular, its domed ceiling adorned with more symbols. In the center of the room stood an elaborate altar, larger and more complex than any they had seen before. Strange artifacts and ancient tomes were scattered around it, the remnants of countless rituals. "This is it," Emily whispered, her voice reverberating in the chamber. "The Nexus Point." As they approached the altar, a cold wind swept through the room, and the symbols on the walls began to glow with an eerie light. Shadows coalesced around them, forming into dark, twisted shapes. "Harold's followers," Sarah said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and determination. "They are still here." The specters advanced, their eyes glowing with malevolent intelligence. Sarah and Emily raised their protective charms, chanting the incantations they had practiced. The shadows recoiled, but the battle was just beginning. Emily focused on the altar, her voice rising as she recited the cleansing spell. Sarah fought off the specters, using her charm and makeshift weapon to hold them at bay. The air crackled with energy as the symbols on the walls flared brighter, the Nexus Point resisting their efforts. Just as it seemed the darkness would overwhelm them, a brilliant light erupted from the altar. The room filled with a blinding radiance, the specters screaming as they were consumed by the light. The symbols on the walls shattered, their power broken. When the light faded, the chamber was silent. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by a sense of calm and finality. Sarah and Emily stood together, exhausted but victorious. "We did it," Sarah said, her voice filled with relief. "The network is broken." Emily nodded, a weary smile on her face. "We've ended Kingsley's dark legacy. The world is safer now." They left the chamber, making their way back through the manor and into the fresh air outside. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over the landscape. As they drove away, Sarah felt a sense of closure and peace. They had faced unimaginable horrors and emerged victorious. The fight against darkness was far from over, but they had proven that courage, friendship, and determination could overcome even the most formidable of evils. Back home, Sarah finished her manuscript, detailing every encounter, every ritual, and every victory. She and Emily knew their story was more than just a recounting of events. It was a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure and triumph over darkness. As Sarah sent off the final draft to her publisher, she felt a sense of accomplishment. The horrors of the mansion, the haunted sites, and the Nexus Point were behind them, but the lessons they had learned would guide them forward. Sarah's book could soon be found in many bookstores all across the globe. Many had read the bestseller Breaking Shadows, The Journey Through Darkness, but only Sarah and Emily had lived it.